The date was March 1st, 1896. Deep within the rugged mountains of East Africa lay a place called Adwa. Dawn had not yet fully broken, and an eerie silence covered the landscape. Through the narrow mountain passes, a massive and well-equipped Italian army advanced with complete confidence. Armed with modern European rifles, heavy artillery, and machine guns, the forces under General Oreste Bartieri believed this would be nothing more than an easy victory. They expected that a handful of African tribesmen and poorly educated farmers carrying spears would stand no chance against the disciplined firepower of a modern European army. In their minds, the battle would be over within hours, and by noon they would have secured the land, adding a new colony to the Italian Empire. But as the sun rose above the mountains, that confidence quickly turned into sheer terror. From the surrounding hills and valleys, an enormous force seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Nearly 100,000 African soldiers appeared before the stunned Italians. They were not armed with only spears and shields. They carried modern rifles and powerful artillery equal to those of the Italian army. Leading this extraordinary force from the front, mounted on horseback, were Emperor Menelik II and his wife, Empress Tetu Batul. A brutal and bloody battle had begun. Within just a few hours, the pride of the Italian army was crushed beyond repair. One of Europe's most powerful modern military forces was overwhelmingly defeated by the soldiers of an independent African nation. Thousands of Italian troops were killed, while the survivors abandoned their weapons and fled in fear. The Battle of Adwa sent shockwaves across the world, dramatically reshaping global geopolitics and dealing a devastating blow to European colonial ambitions. By the late 19th century, European powers such as Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal had carved up almost the entire African continent as if dividing a cake among themselves. Yet one nation stood apart: Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia. How did it become the only African country to preserve its independence? What military brilliance and diplomatic strategy did Emperor Menelik II use to lure the Italian Empire into one of the greatest military disasters in its history? And why, despite repeated attempts, did the European powers never succeed in turning Ethiopia into a colony? In today's documentary, we'll uncover the answers to these extraordinary questions. Before the 1880s, European colonial control was largely confined to Africa's coastal regions. But after the Industrial Revolution, Europe's rapidly expanding factories demanded enormous quantities of raw materials such as rubber, copper, gold, diamonds, and palm oil. And the richest source of these valuable resources was the African continent. This sparked the scramble for Africa, a fierce race among the European powers to seize as much African territory as possible. Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium rushed to claim vast regions of the continent. To prevent these competing empires from going to war with one another over their colonial ambitions, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened a conference between 1884 and 1885, now known as the Berlin Conference. Around a single table, Europe's most powerful nations placed a huge map of Africa before them and used rulers and pencils to divide the continent among themselves. They never consulted a single African king, tribal leader, or ordinary citizen. Within just a few years, nearly the entire African continent had been transformed into European colonies. Only two nations remained outside colonial rule. The first was Liberia, a country founded by formerly enslaved African Americans under the protection of the United States. The second was Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, a vast and ancient empire in East Africa. To the European powers, Ethiopia was an incredibly valuable prize. Located in the Horn of Africa along the Red Sea, it occupied one of the most strategically important positions in the world. Its importance grew even further after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which turned the Red Sea into a vital trade route connecting Europe with Asia. The task of conquering Ethiopia eventually fell to Italy. At the time, Italy was a newly unified nation. Unlike Britain or France, it possessed no vast overseas empire. To establish itself as a major European power, Italy desperately needed colonies of its own. It first occupied the neighboring territories of Eritrea and Somaliland. The ultimate objective was clear: to seize Ethiopia and unite these territories into a massive Italian empire in East Africa. What Italy failed to understand, however, was that Ethiopia was unlike any other African nation. Its history, geography, and leadership made it a completely different challenge. Whenever European powers colonized African lands, they relied on a carefully crafted justification. They claimed, "We are not here to conquer. We are here to civilize these uncivilized people and bring them the light of Christianity. But that so-called civilizing mission simply did not apply to Ethiopia. Ethiopia was not a tribal wilderness or an uncivilized society. It was one of the world's oldest continuous states. Ethiopians believed that their ruling Solomonic dynasty was directly descended from King Solomon of Jerusalem and the Queen of Sheba. Even more importantly, Ethiopia was one of the oldest Christian empires in the world. Long before Christianity had fully spread across Europe, the Kingdom of Aksum adopted Christianity as its official state religion in 330 AD. In other words, the Italians were claiming to bring Christianity to a nation that had embraced the faith centuries before Italy itself. Ethiopia was also protected by its extraordinary geography. This was not a flat and open landscape. It was a natural fortress of towering highlands, deep valleys, and rugged mountain gorges. Advancing through such unforgiving terrain with heavy artillery and long supply lines was a logistical nightmare for any modern European army. Yet despite its rich history and formidable geography, Ethiopia remained politically divided during the late 19th century. Powerful regional rulers, known as races, were locked in constant struggles for influence and control. Italy believed these internal rivalries would make Ethiopia an easy target for conquest. But that assumption was shattered by one remarkable leader, a man who not only united Ethiopia, but also defeated the Europeans at their own game. That man was Emperor Menelik II. Menelik II was the king of Shewa. Following the death of Emperor Johannes IV in 1889, he ascended the throne of Ethiopia. Menelik was an exceptionally intelligent, pragmatic, and visionary statesman. He understood that patriotism, spears, and shields alone would never be enough to protect Ethiopia from European imperialism. To stand against a modern European army, Ethiopia needed modern European weapons. But there was one obvious problem. Why would the European powers sell advanced weapons to an African nation? Menelik answered that question with a geopolitical masterstroke. He skillfully exploited the rivalries among the European powers themselves. At the time, Britain, France, and Italy were engaged in a silent struggle for influence across East Africa. France had no desire to see Italy emerge as a dominant colonial power, while Italy was equally determined to contain French influence. Recognizing this opportunity, Menelik forged strong diplomatic ties with both France and Russia. Russia, as a fellow Orthodox Christian nation, viewed Ethiopia as a natural ally. Through these relationships, Menelik purchased thousands of modern Snyder, Remington, and Gauss rifles from France and Russia. Perhaps even more remarkably, he also bought large quantities of weapons directly from Italy itself. The Italians believed Menelik was their ally and assumed the weapons would be used to suppress his domestic rivals. They never imagined that the very rifles they had sold would one day be turned against their own soldiers. But Menelik's strategy extended far beyond acquiring modern weapons. He reorganized and trained his army using modern European military methods. At the same time, he achieved something equally important. He united Ethiopia's divided regional rulers under a single banner. He convinced them that this was not the time for internal conflicts. If Italy succeeded in conquering Ethiopia, none of their kingdoms would survive. For the first time in its history, Ethiopia stood united as a strong and determined nation, fully prepared to resist European aggression. At the heart of the conflict between Ethiopia and Italy was a treaty signed in 1889, the Treaty of Wuchale. The agreement was intended to establish friendly relations and define the border between the two nations. Two official versions of the treaty were produced, one in Italian and the other in Amharic, Ethiopia's native language. But hidden within Article 17 was a carefully crafted deception. The Italian diplomat, Count Pietro Antonelli, had manipulated the wording of the treaty. In the Amharic version, Article 17 stated that the Emperor of Ethiopia could, if he wished, seek the assistance of the Italian government when communicating with other European nations. It was entirely optional. However, in the Italian version, the same article declared that the Emperor of Ethiopia must conduct all diplomatic relations with European powers exclusively through the Italian government. With the alteration of a single word, Italy attempted one of the greatest diplomatic frauds of the colonial era. Using the Italian version of the treaty, Rome informed the international community that Ethiopia had become an Italian protectorate, claiming that the country had surrendered its sovereignty and was now effectively under Italian control. Italy spread this claim throughout Europe. When Menelik discovered the deception, he was outraged. He made it unmistakably clear that Ethiopia was an independent nation and that he would never accept Italy's fraudulent interpretation of the treaty. In 1890, Menelik bypassed Italy entirely by sending letters directly to European leaders, including Queen Victoria of Britain and the German Kaiser. But the response was deeply humiliating. European governments dismissed his appeals, insisting that, according to the treaty, all communication had to pass through Italy. That insult pushed Menelik to make a historic decision. In February 1893, he officially renounced the Treaty of Wuchale. In a firm letter to the King of Italy, he declared, "My kingdom is an independent kingdom. I will never allow Ethiopia to become the colony of another nation. God has granted Ethiopia its freedom, and God will protect that freedom." After that declaration, war became inevitable. Determined to defend its prestige and imperial ambitions before the rest of Europe, Italy ordered the invasion of Ethiopia in 1895. Thus began the First Italo-Ethiopian War. In late 1895, Italian forces crossed the border from Eritrea and invaded Ethiopia. The campaign was led by General Oreste Baratieri, an experienced military commander. He believed the Ethiopians would rely on scattered guerrilla attacks and would never dare face the superior firepower of the Italian army in a full-scale battle. But Menelik had an entirely different strategy. In the middle of September, he ordered the great Negarit, the traditional war drums, to be sounded across the entire country. For centuries, this had been Ethiopia's sacred call to arms, summoning the nation to defend itself under the command of its emperor. In his proclamation, Menelik declared, "The enemy has come to seize our land. They have come to destroy our faith. Those who are able, take up your weapons. Those who cannot fight, join us in prayer. But let no one remain idle." That single call awakened the entire nation. The people of Tigray in the north, the Oromo in the south, the rulers of Gojam, and countless other regions set aside generations of rivalry and united under Menelik's banner. Within just a few weeks, he assembled an army of more than 100,000 soldiers. Nearly 80,000 of them were equipped with modern rifles. Alongside Menelik, one of the most courageous and influential figures of the campaign was his wife, Empress Taytu Batul. She was far more than a royal consort. She served as Menelik's chief political and military advisor. In December 1895, Menelik's forces laid siege to a heavily fortified Italian stronghold at Mekelle. Protected by powerful defenses, the Italians rained artillery fire on the Ethiopian army from inside the fortress. It was then that Empress Taytu made a brilliant strategic move. Leading her own troops, she seized control of the fortress's main water source, the nearby spring. Cut off from water, the Italian garrison soon found itself trapped in conditions that became nothing short of a living nightmare. Within just a few days, the Italian garrison was forced to surrender. Menelik could have ordered the execution of every prisoner. Instead, he demonstrated remarkable statesmanship and diplomatic restraint. He allowed the captured Italian soldiers to return safely to their main army. Through this act, Menelik wanted to show Europe that he was not a barbaric African ruler, but the leader of a civilized and modern nation. The Italians, however, interpreted this generosity as a sign of weakness. From Rome, Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi issued strict orders demanding that General Albertone launch a decisive and devastating offensive against the Ethiopians at any cost. Under intense political pressure, General Albertone made the greatest and most disastrous decision of his military career. He planned a direct assault against Menelik's massive army on the plains of Adwa. On March 1st, 1896, the day of the decisive battle finally arrived. It was St. George's Day, a sacred occasion for Ethiopians, as St. George was regarded as the protector of the nation. General Baratieri believed that the Ethiopian army would be occupied with prayers and religious celebrations, making it the perfect moment to strike. On the night of February 28th, he ordered his force of nearly 17,700 soldiers to advance through the mountain passes of Adwa in 3 separate brigades. His plan was straightforward: seize the surrounding high ground and bombard Menelik's army with artillery from above. But Baratieri made 2 catastrophic mistakes. First, he had vastly underestimated both the size of Menelik's army and the number of modern weapons in Ethiopian hands. Second, and even more disastrous, the maps of Ethiopia used by the Italian army were dangerously inaccurate. Under the cover of darkness, the 3 brigades commanded by Generals Albertone, Arimondi, and Dabormida lost their way in the rugged mountains. Separated from one another with no radio communication, they occupied the wrong positions and left enormous gaps between their forces. Before sunrise, Ethiopian scouts reported the entire situation to Menelik. He immediately realized that instead of launching a coordinated offensive, the Italians had trapped themselves. At dawn on March 1st, Menelik ordered his army of more than 100,000 soldiers to launch a full-scale assault against the isolated Italian brigades. A fierce battle erupted. From the surrounding heights, Ethiopian riflemen poured relentless gunfire onto the Italian positions. Before the Italian artillery could respond effectively, Ethiopian cavalry charged into their ranks. General Albertoni's brigade was the first to collapse. It was completely overwhelmed, and Albertone himself was taken prisoner. When General Dabormida advanced with his brigade to rescue Albertone, Emperor Menelik personally led his imperial guard into the attack. Dabormida's troops were surrounded on all sides, and the general was killed in the fighting. Before noon, the resistance of the Italian army had completely collapsed. Italian soldiers abandoned their rifles, artillery, and supplies, fleeing blindly through the mountain passes. Ethiopian cavalry relentlessly pursued the retreating forces, cutting them down as they ran. In just 6 hours of fighting, nearly 7,000 Italian soldiers were killed, around 3,000 were captured, and the remaining survivors escaped with their lives. The Ethiopians also paid a heavy price. Approximately 5,000 to 6,000 of Menelik's soldiers were killed under relentless Italian artillery fire. Yet despite those sacrifices, the victory was absolute and decisive. When news of Italy's devastating defeat at Adwa reached Rome, it sent shockwaves across the nation. Public outrage erupted, and massive protests broke out throughout Italy. As pressure mounted, Prime Minister Francesco Crispi was forced to resign. In October 1896, Italy had no choice but to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa with Ethiopia. Under the terms of the agreement, Italy officially annulled the Treaty of Wuchale and formally recognized Ethiopia as a fully independent and sovereign nation. Britain and France were also compelled to establish diplomatic relations with Ethiopia as an equal and independent state. Thanks to Emperor Menelik II's extraordinary leadership and strategic brilliance, Ethiopia became the only African nation to defeat a major European colonial power in open warfare and successfully preserve its independence. After the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia remained fully independent for nearly 40 years. But the humiliation Italy suffered at Adwa never faded from the nation's memory. They simply waited for an opportunity to take revenge. During the 1920s, fascism rose to power in Italy under Benito Mussolini. Mussolini dreamed of restoring the glory of the ancient Roman Empire, and Ethiopia stood as the greatest obstacle to that ambition. The defeat at Adwa had become a lasting stain on Italy's military pride. Determined to erase that humiliation, Mussolini decided that Ethiopia had to be conquered at any cost. In October 1935, without a formal declaration of war, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, marking the beginning of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. This time, Emperor Haile Selassie ruled Ethiopia. Once again, the Ethiopians fought with extraordinary determination. But the Italy of 1935 was far more powerful than the Italy defeated at Adwa in 1896. Mussolini's forces resorted to brutal tactics and employed weapons banned under international law. Italian warplanes repeatedly dropped chemical agents, including mustard gas and phosgene, on both Ethiopian soldiers and civilians. Thousands of Ethiopians died agonizing deaths from these chemical attacks. Forced into exile, Emperor Haile Selassie traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, where he delivered a historic and deeply emotional speech before the League of Nations in 1936. He pleaded with the world to save Ethiopia. But Britain and France were unwilling to confront Mussolini. They offered Ethiopia no meaningful assistance. In May 1936, Italian forces captured Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital. However, an important historical distinction must be made. Although Italy occupied Ethiopia from 1936 to 1941, historians and international legal scholars generally classify this period as a military occupation rather than a permanent colonial settlement. Similar occupations occurred frequently during the Second World War, such as Nazi Germany's occupation of France. Even during those 5 years, Italy never succeeded in fully pacifying Ethiopia. Ethiopian patriots, known as the Arbognak, waged a relentless guerrilla campaign from the mountains and forests, launching continuous attacks that made Italian rule unstable and costly. Despite controlling major cities, Italy never established complete political or administrative authority over the entire country. Finally, in 1941, during the Second World War, British forces and Ethiopian resistance fighters launched a joint offensive that drove the Italians out of Ethiopia for good. Emperor Haile Selassie returned triumphantly to his throne. In the end, Mussolini's invasion proved to be only a temporary military occupation. Like those before him, he ultimately failed to transform Ethiopia into a lasting Italian colony. At a time when nearly the entire African continent was being crushed under European colonial rule, Ethiopia proved that an African nation could defeat a powerful European empire. The victory at Adwa became a defining moment in history, inspiring the rise of Pan-Africanism and strengthening the dream of African unity across the world. Black civil rights leaders such as Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois embraced Ethiopia as the ultimate symbol of Black dignity, freedom, and resistance. In Jamaica, followers of the Rastafari movement came to regard Emperor Haile Selassie as the promised Messiah and the living embodiment of divine authority. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Ethiopia's victory can be seen in the flags of modern Africa. As one African nation after another gained independence during the mid-20th century, many deliberately adopted the colors of the Ethiopian flag, green, yellow, and red, as the colors of their own national identity. From Ghana and Senegal to Mali and Cameroon, these three colors became a silent tribute to the only African nation that had successfully preserved its independence against European colonial conquest. The myth of European military invincibility, which colonial powers had spread across the world, was buried forever on the battlefield of Adwa by Emperor Menelik II and the ordinary Ethiopian men and women who stood beside him. Their victory proved that while modern weapons can help win battles, no imperial power can ultimately overcome a nation united by an unbreakable desire for freedom, visionary leadership, and unwavering national unity.